"I remember you," said the blind woman to the outlaw, who thought he'd changed his voice forever. The dust hung in the morning air like a prayer that God had not yet answered. Billy Harper stood at the edge of Millfield, watching the sun climb over the wooden buildings that seemed smaller now, worn down by 20 years of wind and time. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the weight in his chest, the way his breathing had changed when they crested the hill, and he saw the place he had tried so hard to forget. The town looked like it was dying. Half the buildings stood empty, their windows dark as closed eyes. The street was quiet except for the sound of his horse's hooves on packed earth, each step marking time like a clock that counted backward instead of forward. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the long years of running, but he never thought it would feel like drowning in air. He pulled his hat lower over his face and tried to make himself smaller in the saddle. 20 years should have changed him enough. The boy who left this place had been thin and scared, with a voice that cracked when he was nervous. The man who returned was broader, harder, with lines around his eyes and gray in his beard. Surely no one would know him now. Martha's general store stood where it always had, at the corner of Main and Cedar, though the paint on the sign had faded until the letters looked more like suggestions than words. Billy tied his horse to the post and stood for a moment, gathering courage like a man collecting water in his cupped hands, knowing most of it would slip through his fingers before he could drink. The door creaked when he pushed it open, and the smell hit him like a fist to the stomach. Flour and coffee and the sweet scent of penny candy in glass jars. It was exactly the same smell from when he was 12 years old and would spend his last nickel on peppermint sticks, back when Martha Callahan could see his face and smile at him like he was worth something. She stood behind the counter now, her hair white as winter clouds, her hands moving over the surface of the wood like she was reading a book written in a language only her fingers could understand. Her eyes looked past him toward the door, milky and distant, but her face turned toward the sound of his footsteps with the precision of a compass finding north. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice was exactly the same, soft and kind, with a little roughness around the edges like worn velvet. Billy cleared his throat and tried to make his voice different, deeper, rougher than it had been when he was young. "Ma'am, I need some supplies. Flour, coffee, maybe some jerky if you have it." Martha's hands went still on the counter. For a moment, she said nothing, and Billy felt his heart beating like a rabbit caught in a trap. Then her fingers began to move again, slow and careful, as if she was feeling for something that might break if she moved too fast. "You're traveling through?" she asked, reaching for a flour sack without looking, her movements as sure as if she could see every item in the store. "Yes, ma'am. Just passing through." She lifted the flour sack and set it on the counter with a soft thud. Her head tilted slightly, like a bird listening for something in the distance. "It's been a long time since we've had many strangers in Millfield. Most people take the railroad now. Faster that way." Billy watched her hands as she measured coffee beans into a paper bag. They were older hands than he remembered, with brown spots and blue veins that showed through skin thin as tissue paper, but they moved with the same gentle care they always had. When he was small and had scraped his knee or cut his finger, those hands had cleaned the wound and wrapped it in clean cloth while she whispered that everything would heal, given time. "Some of us prefer the old ways," he said, and immediately regretted it. The words sounded too familiar, too much like something the boy he used to be might have said. Martha's hands paused again. This time, the silence stretched longer, filled with the sound of flies buzzing against the window and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the town. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, more careful. "The old ways," she repeated. "Yes, I suppose some people do." She reached for a jar of jerky and began wrapping pieces in brown paper. Though sometimes the old ways carry old pain with them, like a stone in your shoe that you can't shake out, no matter how many miles you walk. Billy's throat felt dry as desert sand. He wanted to leave, to throw money on the counter and walk out of the store and ride until his horse collapsed, and then keep walking until he found a place where no one had ever heard his voice before. But something in Martha's tone held him there, like a hand on his shoulder that was gentle but firm. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I suppose they do." She finished wrapping the jerky and set it beside the other supplies. Then she stood very still, her blind eyes aimed in his direction like she was looking right through him to something on the other side. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Billy Harper," she said, "I thought you might come back someday." The words hit him like cold water. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there while the truth settled around him like dust after a windstorm. All his planning, all his careful changes to his voice and his appearance, all the years he had spent becoming someone else, none of it mattered. She knew him as easily as if he had never left. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but the words came out weak and hollow, like an echo of a lie someone else had told. Martha smiled then, and it was the saddest smile Billy had ever seen. "Your voice," she said. "I would know it anywhere. It's the same voice that used to ask for extra molasses cookies. The same voice that promised my Sarah you would marry her someday, when you were both old enough. The same voice that called out my name the night the fire started." Billy felt something break inside his chest, something that had been holding him together for 20 years. He gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling, and when he spoke again, he didn't try to change his voice anymore. "Martha," he said, and her name tasted like ashes in his mouth. "Martha, I know," she said, and her hand moved across the counter toward him, stopping just short of where his fingers gripped the wood. "I know why you left. I know why you stayed away. And I know why you came back." The morning sun had climbed higher, and now it slanted through the window at a different angle, casting new shadows across the floor of the store. Outside, Billy could hear the normal sounds of a town beginning its day. A dog barking, a door slamming, the creak of wagon wheels. But inside the store, everything felt suspended in a moment that could last forever or end in the next heartbeat. Martha's hand still hovered near his, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin, but not close enough to touch. Between them lay 20 years of silence, 20 years of questions that had never been asked and answers that had never been given. And Billy realized, with the slow certainty of sunrise, that running away had never been about distance at all. Billy's hands shook as he reached for the coins in his pocket. The metal felt cold against his fingers, like pieces of winter that never melted. Martha stood waiting behind the counter, her face turned toward him with the patience of someone who had learned to measure time differently than the rest of the world. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, though his voice came out smaller than he intended. $3.60, Martha said. She moved to the cash box with the same careful grace she had always possessed, her fingers finding the right compartment without hesitation. "But there's no hurry. The supplies will keep." Billy placed the money on the counter, making sure the coins didn't clink together too loudly. Everything felt fragile now, like the whole store might collapse if he made the wrong sound. He should leave. He should take his supplies and ride out of town and never look back. That was what the smart part of him whispered. That was what 20 years of running had taught him. But his feet wouldn't move. "Martha," he said, and her name felt strange on his tongue after so many years. "I want you to know, sit," she said, and pointed to an old wooden chair beside the counter. "Please. My legs aren't what they used to be, and I have a feeling this conversation will take some time." Billy looked at the chair. It was the same one that had always been there, worn smooth by countless people who had stopped to rest while Martha measured their flour or wrapped their purchases. He remembered sitting in that chair when he was 8 years old, swinging his legs and listening to Martha tell stories about the early days of the town, when it was nothing but a few tents and big dreams. He sat down slowly, his spurs making soft music against the wooden floor. Martha moved around the counter and settled into another chair, one that creaked under her weight like it was welcoming an old friend home. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with dust motes dancing in the morning light and the distant sound of someone hammering nails into wood. "Tell me about the years," Martha said finally. "Tell me where you went after that night." Billy stared at his hands. They were different hands now, scarred and weathered, with calluses in places that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "I rode south," he said. "Kept riding until I couldn't ride anymore. Found work on a ranch in Texas. Learned to be someone else." "And did you become someone else?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Billy thought about all the names he had used, all the towns where he had been just another drifter looking for work. He thought about the nights when he had lain awake listening to coyotes howl and wondering if the sound they made was anything like the sound of his own soul crying. "I tried," he said. "God knows I tried." Martha nodded slowly. "I tried to become someone else too, after the fire. Someone who couldn't remember what it felt like to see the sun on my daughter's hair. Someone who couldn't hear the echo of my husband's laugh in empty rooms." She folded her hands in her lap, and Billy noticed how they never quite stopped moving, as if they were always reaching for something that wasn't there. But trying to forget who you are is like trying to forget how to breathe. You can hold your breath for a while, but eventually you have to let it out. Billy's chest felt tight. "Martha, what happened that night? I know what happened," she said, and her voice was steady as bedrock. 3 men came to rob the bank. They were young and scared, and probably hadn't eaten a good meal in days. When Sheriff Morrison tried to stop them, one of them panicked and knocked over a lantern in the bank. The fire spread faster than anyone could imagine. Billy closed his eyes, but closing them only made the memories sharper. He could still smell the smoke, still hear the screams, still feel the heat on his face as he ran toward his horse while the flames climbed the walls like hungry ghosts. By the time we got the Bucket Brigade organized, Martha continued, half the block was burning. The bank, the hotel, the dress shop where Mrs. Patterson made wedding gowns for young brides. Her voice grew softer. My house was the last to catch fire. Samuel, my husband, he ran back inside to get Sarah. She had hidden under the bed, too scared to come out. Billy opened his eyes and found Martha looking in his direction, her blind gaze somehow finding his face with perfect accuracy. "They never came back out," she said. "The roof came down just as I reached the door." Samuel was carrying Sarah in his arms. She was still wearing the white nightgown I had sewn for her, the one with little roses embroidered around the collar. The words hit Billy like physical blows. Each detail, the nightgown, the roses, the roof collapsing, landed in his chest and settled there like stones at the bottom of a well. The doctor said a burning beam caught me across the face as I tried to follow them inside. Martha said, "When I woke up 3 days later, the world had gone dark, and I was the only one left from my family. The only one left to remember how Sarah liked to collect smooth stones from the creek, or how Samuel always whistled while he shaved in the morning." Billy's throat felt raw. "Martha, I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." "I know you are," she said. "I could hear in your voice that night when you called out to me. You weren't running from the law, Billy. You were running from the sound of your own conscience." She reached across the space between their chairs and found his hand. Her fingers were soft and warm, and when they touched his skin, Billy felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The simple comfort of being known by another person. "The other 2 men," she said. "What happened to them?" Billy's hand tensed under hers. "Jack Morrison, the sheriff's nephew. He got himself killed in a saloon fight 2 years later. Pete Calloway, he took his own life. Left a note saying he couldn't live with what we'd done. And you?" Billy looked at their joined hands, his dark and scarred, hers pale and gentle. "I lived," he said. "I kept breathing when I didn't deserve to. I kept waking up every morning when Samuel and Sarah couldn't." Martha's thumb moved across his knuckles, tracing the line of an old scar he'd gotten from barbed wire. "Living isn't the same as being alive," she said. "Just like seeing isn't the same as understanding." Outside, the town was waking up. Billy could hear the sound of horses being led to water, the creak of wagon wheels, the soft voices of people beginning their daily routines. Normal sounds from a normal morning in a place where normal people live normal lives. He wondered what it would feel like to be one of them, to wake up without the weight of old sins pressing down on his chest like stones. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "When they asked who had robbed the bank, why didn't you tell them it was me?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I remembered you as a little boy, bringing me wildflowers you'd picked behind the schoolhouse. Because I remembered you crying when your mother died, and how you used to help your father fix wagons, even though you were barely tall enough to reach the wheel hubs. She squeezed his hand gently, because I knew that the boy who did those things was still somewhere inside the young man who made that terrible mistake. Billy felt tears on his cheeks, the first tears he had shed in 20 years. They fell silently, like rain on desert ground. And Martha sat with him while he wept for the family she had lost, and the boy he used to be, and all the years that lay between what was and what might have been. When the tears finally stopped, Martha released his hand and stood up slowly. "You'll need a place to stay," she said. "There's a room above the store. It's not much, but it's clean and quiet." Billy looked up at her, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Martha, I can't." "You can," she said, "and you will. Because running away didn't fix anything the first time, and it won't fix anything now." She turned toward the counter, her movements sure and purposeful, leaving Billy to sit in the morning light and wonder if redemption was something that could be measured out like flour, or if it came all at once like rain after a long drought. The room above Martha's store smelled like old wood and lavender soap. Billy stood at the small window, looking down at the street where morning shadows stretched long and thin across the dusty ground. He had been in Millfield for 5 days now, and each morning he told himself he would leave before sunset. Each evening, he found a reason to stay one more night. His horse stood in the stable behind the store, fed and watered, and probably wondering why they weren't moving on. Billy understood the feeling. Every part of his body wanted to be somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere he could pretend to be the man he had spent 20 years becoming. But his feet kept carrying him downstairs to Martha's store, where she waited with that strange combination of blindness and perfect sight. This morning, like the others, he found her arranging jars on a shelf that didn't need arranging. Her fingers moved over each container with the careful attention of someone reading a favorite book, checking that everything was exactly where it belonged. "Morning, Martha," he said, and the words came easier now, without the weight of pretense making them heavy. "Billy," she said, and smiled in his direction. "I was hoping you'd come down early today. Mrs. Henderson will be by for her weekly supplies, and she always brings enough gossip to fill a water barrel. I thought you might prefer to be useful rather than hiding upstairs listening to her talk about whose chickens are laying and whose aren't." Billy almost smiled. "Almost? What kind of useful?" Martha pointed toward a stack of flour sacks that had been delivered the day before. "Those need to go to the storage room and back. And there's a shelf that's been wobbling for weeks. I keep meaning to ask someone to fix it, but—" She shrugged, and the gesture was so familiar that Billy felt something twist in his chest. "I can fix it," he said. "I know you can. Your father taught you well." The mention of his father hit Billy like a cold wind. Thomas Harper had been a good man, honest and hard-working, who fixed wagons and mended fences and never asked for more than a fair price for fair work. He would have been ashamed of what his son had become. First an outlaw, then a coward who ran from his mistakes. Billy lifted the first flour sack, surprised by how heavy it was. His body wasn't as young as it used to be, and these past years of drifting from ranch to ranch had left him lean, but not particularly strong. Martha watched him struggle with the weight, her head tilted like she was listening to something only she could hear. "Careful with your back," she said. "Those sacks are heavier than they look." Billy paused, the flour balanced against his chest. "How did you know I was the way you breathe in when you lifted it? The small sound you made when you adjusted your grip." Martha moved to the counter and began measuring coffee into small paper bags. When you can't see what people are doing, you learn to hear what they're feeling. Billy carried the flour to the storage room, thinking about what she had said. When he came back for the second sack, Martha was humming softly while she worked, a tune he remembered from childhood, something his mother used to sing while she kneaded bread. The melody made his chest ache with memories of Sunday mornings and the smell of fresh biscuits and the sound of his parents' quiet laughter drifting from the kitchen. "I remember that song," he said. Martha's hands stilled on the coffee beans. "Your mother had a lovely voice. She used to sing in the church choir before." She stopped, and Billy knew she was thinking about the fever that had taken his mother when he was 14, leaving him and his father to figure out how to live in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. "She did," Billy said. "She used to say music was just prayers set to melody." Your mother was a wise woman. Martha resumed her measuring, but her movements were gentler now, as if the memory had made her hands more careful. She will be proud of the man you've become. Billy nearly dropped the second flour sack. Martha, you don't know what I've done. What I became after I left here. Tell me. The simple words hung in the air between them. Billy looked at Martha's face, at the scars that traced pale lines across her forehead and cheek, and wondered how someone who had lost everything could speak with such gentle certainty. I can't, he said. You can, but you don't have to. Not today. Billy carried the rest of the flour sacks to the storage room in silence, each trip giving him time to think about the weight of secrets and the way Martha's kindness felt both like a gift and a burden. When he finished, he found a loose shelf and knelt beside it with his father's tools, which Martha had somehow known to keep in a wooden box behind the counter. The work was familiar and soothing. His hands remembered the feel of wood and the weight of a hammer, the satisfaction of making something broken whole again. While he worked, Martha moved around the store, straightening shelves and dusting jars, and the rhythm of their separate tasks created a kind of music that filled the quiet spaces between them. Billy, she said after a while, can I ask you something? Billy paused, a nail halfway into the wood. I reckon, in all those years you were gone, did you ever try to come home? The question hit him like a physical blow. Billy set down his hammer and sat back on his heels, looking at the half-fixed shelf. Every year, he said finally, on the anniversary, I'd ride to the top of Miller's Hill and look down at the town. Sometimes I'd sit up there for hours just looking, but you never came down. No, I'd see the smoke from chimneys, hear the church bells on Sunday morning, and I'd think about all the people who remembered that night, who remembered what I'd done. Billy picked up the hammer again, turning it over in his hands. I was afraid they'd see the guilt written on my face like words in a book. Martha was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft as morning mist. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry, Billy, but it's not meant to be carried alone. Billy finished fixing the shelf, testing it with his weight to make sure it was solid. When he stood up, he found Martha standing near the window, her face turned toward the street like she was watching something he couldn't see. What is it? He asked. Mrs. Patterson, Martha said. She's coming up the walk, and she's got that determined look in her step. She's probably going to ask about you, the stranger who's been staying above the store. Billy felt his chest tighten. What should I tell her? Martha turned away from the window and looked in his direction. Tell her the truth. Tell her you're Billy Harper, and you've come home. Martha, I can't. You can, she said, and her voice was firm but kind. You've been hiding for 20 years, Billy. Don't you think it's time to stop? The door chimed as Mrs. Patterson entered, a small woman with sharp eyes and gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun. She glanced at Billy with the curiosity of someone who had lived in a small town long enough to know every face, and she clearly didn't know his. Good morning, Martha, Mrs. Patterson said. I see you have company. Martha smiled. Yes, Mrs. Patterson, I'd like you to meet Billy Harper. He's staying with me for a while. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened, and Billy watched recognition dawn on her face like sunrise. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Patterson's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. Billy, she said, you look like your father. Billy's throat felt dry. Mrs. Patterson, I was sorry to hear about Thomas, she continued. He was a good man. Died too young. Billy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His father had passed 3 years ago, and Billy hadn't even known until months later, when a letter finally caught up with him at a ranch in New Mexico. By then, Thomas Harper had already been in the ground for half a year, buried next to Billy's mother in the little cemetery behind the church. Mrs. Patterson bought her usual supplies, flour, sugar, a can of peaches, and made polite conversation with Martha about the weather and the church social plan for next month. But Billy could feel her watching him, taking in the lines around his eyes and the gray in his beard, measuring the boy she remembered against the man who stood before her. When she left, Billy sank into the chair beside the counter and put his head in his hands. That wasn't so bad, Martha said. Billy looked up at her. She'll tell everyone. Yes, she will. By tomorrow morning, The whole town will know you're back." Martha moved to her chair and sat down with a small sigh. Is that such a terrible thing? Billy thought about all the people who had known him as a child, who had watched him grow up, and probably wondered what had become of Thomas Harper's boy. He thought about walking down the street and seeing recognition in their eyes, having to carry the weight of their judgment along with his own guilt. "I don't know if I can face them," he said. Martha leaned forward in her chair. "Billy, can I tell you something about forgiveness?" Billy nodded, though he wasn't sure she could see the gesture. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn," she said. "It's something you accept, like grace or rain, or the fact that the sun rises every morning whether you deserve it or not." She reached across the space between them and found his hand. "You've been trying to make yourself worthy of forgiveness for 20 years. But worthiness isn't the point. The point is learning to live with an open heart instead of a closed fist." Billy looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that had been locked for too long. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of the town. Horses and wagons, voices calling to each other, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. It was the same music he had listened to as a child, the rhythm of a place where people knew each other's names and remembered each other's stories. "Martha," he said, "what if they can't forgive me? Then that's their burden to carry, not yours," she said. "But Billy, you might be surprised. People remember the fire, yes, but they also remember the boy who used to help his father fix their wagons, who brought wildflowers to shut-ins, who cried at his mother's funeral because he loved her so much." Billy squeezed her hand gently, and for the first time in 20 years, he began to believe that coming home might not be the same thing as giving up. The rain started on Billy's 7th day in Millfield, drumming against the roof of Martha's store like fingers tapping out an old song. Billy sat at the small table by the window, watching water run down the glass in crooked rivers while Martha prepared for the morning customers who probably wouldn't come in weather like this. He had been thinking about leaving. Not running this time, but making a choice. The whole town knew he was back now, and most people had been kinder than he'd expected. Old Mr. Jameson had shaken his hand and said he was sorry about Billy's father. Mrs. Chun at the cafe had served him coffee without asking questions. Even Sheriff Morrison, Jack's older brother who had taken over after the old sheriff died, had nodded politely when they passed on the street. But kindness was almost harder to bear than anger. Anger he could understand, could use as fuel to keep running. Kindness made him want to stay, and staying felt like the most dangerous thing he could do. "You're thinking loud this morning," Martha said from behind the counter. Billy looked up from his coffee. "How do you mean?" "I can hear in the way you're breathing, the way your spoon clinks against your cup. You're making decisions in your head." Martha moved to her chair and sat down with that careful grace that never failed to remind Billy of his own clumsiness. "Want to talk about it?" Billy set down his cup and looked at his hands. 20 years of work had left them scarred and weathered, but they were still the same hands that had helped his father fix wagons, that had picked wildflowers for Martha's daughter, that had held a gun on that terrible night when everything changed. "I've been thinking about moving on," he said. Martha nodded slowly. "I wondered when you'd get around to that thought. It's not running this time. It's just, maybe it's better if I don't stay. For you. For the town. Better for who?" Billy looked up and found Martha watching him with that strange way she had of seeing without seeing. "Better for everyone. I don't belong here anymore, Martha. Maybe I never did." Martha was quiet for a long moment, and Billy could hear the rain getting heavier, drumming against the windows like it was trying to get inside. Finally, she spoke. "Billy, can I tell you about the day you left?" Billy's chest tightened. "Martha, you don't need to, I want to." She folded her hands in her lap, and Billy noticed how they trembled slightly. It was 3 days after the fire. "I was staying with the Hendersons because their house was far enough from the fire that it didn't burn. Dr. Williams had just told me that my sight wasn't coming back, that the burns had gone too deep." Her voice was steady, but Billy could hear the old pain underneath it like rocks in a riverbed. "I was sitting on their porch, trying to figure out how to live in a world I couldn't see when I heard your voice." Billy remembered that day. He had gone to every house that survived the fire, looking for Martha, needing to see that she was alive, even though he knew he could never tell her he was sorry. "You were talking to Mrs. Henderson," Martha continued, "asking how I was doing, if there was anything I needed." Your voice was different than it had been before the fire. Older, sadder, but there was something else in it too. "What?" "Love," Martha said simply. "You were scared and guilty and probably planning to run away, but underneath all of that, there was love. Love for me, love for Sarah and Samuel, love for this place that had been your home." She looked toward the window, where rain continued to streak the glass. "That's when I knew that the boy who brought me wildflowers was still in there, even if he was buried under all that guilt and shame." Billy felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Martha, I killed your family." "No," she said, and her voice was firm. "You made a terrible mistake. A young man's mistake, made out of desperation and fear. But you didn't set that fire on purpose, and you didn't want anyone to get hurt. It doesn't matter what I wanted. What matters is what happened." Martha stood up and moved to the window, her fingers finding the glass like she could touch the rain through it. "Billy, do you know what I did for the first 5 years after the fire?" Billy shook his head, then realized she couldn't see the gesture. "No, I hated you," she said, and the words hit Billy like physical blows. "I lay in bed every night and imagined what I would say to you if you ever came back. How I would make you feel the pain you had caused me. How I would make sure everyone in town knew exactly what you had done." Billy's hands clenched into fists on the table. This was what he had expected, what he had been prepared for. This was easier than kindness. "But hatred is heavy," Martha continued. "And after 5 years, I was tired of carrying it around. So I started trying to remember you differently. Not as the young man who helped rob the bank, but as the little boy who used to visit my store. The boy who cried when his mother died and worked so hard to help his father after she was gone." She turned away from the window and faced him again. "That's when I realized something, Billy. You weren't the only one who lost everything that night. You lost your home, your family's good name, your place in this community. In a way, you lost just as much as I did." Billy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's not the same thing, Martha. You lost your husband and daughter. I lost my reputation. You lost your future," Martha said quietly. "You lost the chance to marry Sarah, to have children, to take over your father's business. You lost the chance to become the man you were meant to be." She moved toward him, her steps sure and careful. "Instead, you became the man you thought you deserved to be. A drifter, a stranger, someone with no roots and no home." Billy backed away from her until he felt the wall against his shoulders. "Maybe that is who I deserve to be." "Maybe," Martha said, "but maybe deserving isn't the point anymore." She reached out and found his face with her hands, her palms cool against his cheeks. Billy wanted to pull away, but something in her touch held him still. "Billy," she said, and her voice was softer than rain. "I forgive you." The words broke something inside him that had been holding together through will and stubbornness alone. Billy collapsed forward, and Martha caught him, her arms circling his shoulders as he sobbed against her neck like a child. 20 years of guilt and shame and loneliness poured out of him in great, heaving waves, and Martha held him through all of it, her hand stroking his hair while she whispered the same words over and over. "I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you." When the tears finally stopped, Billy pulled back and looked at Martha's face. The scars were still there, silver lines across her forehead and cheek, but her expression was peaceful in a way that made her look younger than her years. "Why?" he asked. Martha smiled. "Because forgiveness isn't something you do for the person who hurt you. It's something you do for yourself. And because I wanted to remember you as the boy who brought me wildflowers, not the young man who ran away." Billy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, casting golden squares of light across the floor of the store. "What do I do now?" he asked. "Whatever you want," Martha said. "You can stay here and help me run the store. You can leave and make a new life somewhere else. You can do anything, Billy, because you're finally free to choose." Billy looked around the store, at the shelves he had fixed, the floor he had swept, the windows he had cleaned. It looked different now, like a place where he might belong instead of a place where he was hiding. If I stayed, he said carefully, people would talk. People always talk. That's what people do. They'd remember the fire every time they looked at me. Yes, Martha said, but they'd also remember that you came back, that you faced what you'd done instead of running from it forever. That matters, Billy. It matters more than you know. Billy walked to the window and looked out at the street, where puddles reflected the clearing sky like pieces of broken mirror. He could see Mrs. Patterson coming up the walk, probably to check on Martha and get a better look at the man who had come home after 20 years. Behind her, Sheriff Morrison was making his rounds, tipping his hat to the people he passed. Normal people living normal lives in the place Billy used to call home. I don't know if I know how to stay in one place anymore, Billy said. Martha joined him at the window. It's like learning to walk again after a long sickness. You take it one step at a time, and you don't worry too much about falling down. Billy looked at her profile, at the way the morning light caught the silver in her hair. She had aged in the 20 years since he'd seen her, but there was something ageless about her, too, something that belonged to the part of her that had always been able to see what others missed. Martha, he said. Thank you. She reached out and found his hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you for coming home, Billy. Thank you for giving me the chance to forgive you. The door chimed as Mrs. Patterson entered, shaking rain from her umbrella and looking around the store with bright, curious eyes. When she saw Billy and Martha standing together by the window, she smiled. Good morning, she said. I hope you didn't get too wet in that storm. No, ma'am, Billy said. We stayed nice and dry. Mrs. Patterson nodded and began browsing the shelves, humming softly to herself. Billy watched her for a moment, then turned back to Martha. I think I'd like to stay, he said quietly, if you'll have me. Martha's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I'd like that too, she said. I like that very much. Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, filling the store with golden light that made everything look new and possible. Billy squeezed Martha's hand and thought about the boy he used to be, the man he had become, and the person he might still have time to become. For the first time in 20 years, the future felt like a gift instead of a burden. And in the gentle rhythm of Martha's breathing, in the sound of Mrs. Patterson humming while she shopped, in the distant call of children playing in puddles on the street, Billy heard something he had almost forgotten existed, the sound of coming home.